Hi, David. You're muted.
Hi.
Hey.
Dear. So, yeah, if the conversation with Rob isn't going that great, I'm happy to set up something independent with you. Like if there's not quite the right magic there, then I'm happy to do something independent. We were just exploring how that goes. Are you happy with the conversation, or I got a sense that it wasn't quite what you were expecting?
Yeah, I didn't really expect anything. I was just, yeah, I mean, it's up to you. Yeah, I have zero expectation of these conversations. That's the fun for me. Like if I go in with expectations, then it makes it like work.
No, and it's not intended to be work. So yeah, no, so I did want to chat to you about your experiment that you did. Now, you've looked at Kahneman and Tversky, right? You've read some or...
I've read Thinking Fast and Slow. And I've listened.
Do you remember the S curve that they created, the prospect theory curve?
I can't remember. I probably read about it, but it sounds familiar. But if you explain it, maybe I'll remember.
Okay, so the idea is that there is this kind of graph that's basically along the bottom is, let's call it true risk or true risk. And then on the vertical axis, you have perceived risk, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're in the lower part of the graph, then the curve, hi Rob, I'll let him join. I'm just going to do a whiteboard. Yeah. Rob knows this curve well. So let's call this true risk here, down here, true risk. And then this is perceived risk. And a rational agent would have, sorry, that's not a very straight line. I'll try again. I'll try and draw it quickly. Yeah, there we go. So that would be a rational agent. Mm-hmm. And then what Kahneman and Tversky observed is this kind of thing here, where agents in a low risk scenario are risk seeking, so their perception of the true risk is diminished. Mm-hmm. Whereas once they get to a certain level of endowment, this is called the endowment effect, mm-hmm. Their behavior changes and
they panic a little bit,
and they become risk averse.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So in your experiment, you were training agents, right? Do you want to describe your little kind of machine learning experiment you described to us that you've been working on?
Oh, are you talking about the El Farol game?
Yeah, the ones where essentially it's just a stochastic result and nothing really happens.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so far I haven't trained an intelligent agent yet. It's basically just self-adaptive. So every agent has 10 or n strategies, and it picks the one that worked best the last m times. And it just cycles through different agents, and they just adapt based on what they've seen to one of those strategies. So these are deterministic, predetermined strategies. So
but the sampling is linear, right?
What do you mean by sampling?
Oh, there is no sampling. So when they stochastically choose which strategy, they're all rated equal.
Yeah, so each one has 10 random strategy, which is just a linear regression model. So
okay,
a bunch of coefficients, yeah. And then those are
so generated. What I'm suggesting is that you layer this curve in between, you inject this transfer function somewhere in your model, and you should see the behavior of the agents change, where if they are on a winning streak, they become very conservative, and if they're on a losing streak, they become more risk seeking.
Oh, I see what you mean. Okay. No, that looks interesting.
Yeah. Anyway, hi Rose. Hi Rob.
Hello.
Hi. Good morning.
Okay, I'll stop sharing. That's great. Wow. So did anyone have a chance to read the Chomsky stuff? Mm-hmm. Yes, Rob?
Yeah, I got started on it.
Interesting. Yeah. So I'll try and characterize my understanding. So his proposal is that there's no way that a human being could learn language as a tabula rasa, and that there is an inherent intrinsic mechanism within us that a language sits on top of, and it's just a matter of tuning that innate mechanism to a specific language structure like English or Spanish, and you're good to go. Is that does that match the understanding that you've gained, Rose?
Yeah, that sounds about right to me.
That's more the Skinner view, right?
The Skinnerian view is that it is tabula rasa, and that they literally learn mathematics in their head without knowing it.
That's what struck me. Like that was the most interesting part of the reading, not the Chomsky part, because the Skinner view is basically what GPT-3 and all the modern language models are based on. Basically, they're trying to do that.
Right.
And I didn't know about the Skinner view, but like if you could come up with a whatever mascot for the new language models, it would be Skinner. Like it was interesting. If you replace wherever he said a human being with like AI algorithms, that would be exactly what they're trying to do. Right?
Yeah, it kind of struck me as a big RL framework.
So can RL be model free?
Well, in a technical sense, it could be,
What
right?
do you mean? What do you mean by model?
So basically, Chomsky's argument is that language is not model free, is that there's this underlying mechanism which is deterministic, which is the model, and then we're just tuning the parameters of this pre-existing model to generate the language that we get. Whereas in the Skinnerian view, there is no model. There's just.
But he's focused on humans, right? This is all about language in humans. So you could say maybe humans need the models. Humans have the innateness. Doesn't mean you need innateness in principle, right?
Well, that gets to the purpose of language, right? So what is the purpose
And
of
what
language?
we're trying to replicate.
Are we trying to create? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just exactly that. Like, isn't that what we're trying to do with AI? For the most part, we're trying to replicate human intelligence.
No, we want to supersede it by a billion times. We don't want to replicate. If you want to replicate human intelligence, have a baby, right?
Well, I mean, a lot of the time, the judgments we're trying to make, it's not like we're trying to make the decision of what's really the best answer. We're just trying to say what's the best answer given our social constraints.
Sure. So we want to constrain it. We don't want to limit it by other things, right? Like, yeah, sure, you want to put social constraints and other things in it, but those are the things that humans learn by interaction. Are we saying that these constraints are innate? I don't think so. Like you can raise different human beings in different cultures and they would have different constraints. So if anything, that's the part that's clearly learned, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's the value that Chomsky is bringing to this, because he's not saying there's just the universal grammar. He's saying that there is also interaction with the environment, and it's not. It kind of comes back to the nativist argument, right? He's saying that's not the case. It's not just that it's all programmed in, and it's going to unfold the same way regardless of what happens in the environment. There has to be some level of input from the environment too, and context to actually get you where you finally are with language.
Yeah,
I think this sort of ties back into some of the other reading that we were doing around the Hume stuff. Like what are these? What is innate, right? And Chomsky is talking about it specifically in terms of language. But I guess I would tie that back more to the McGilchrist idea that we are able to identify objects and objects in the real world, and then we're able to sort of combine those objects or imagine those objects into other more abstract things that aren't really things, they're ideas, right? But there's still something that's innate there to begin with. And that's part of what language is doing.
It's actually interesting. So I wonder, so you talked about models, David. So I wonder, so let's say you had a brain which has some architecture, right? There's a certain way everything is organized. And so can we call that a model, like the structure of your model? So like a neural network, like you decide how many layers you want and how you want to organize it. Do we want convolution layers or not? So you can call that innateness, right? Without any training of the weights. So is that what we're calling? Is that roughly what we think when we think innateness, like the structure of the brain or the structure of the model before you interact with the environment?
Yes. So I would.
Yeah, and I guess
Go ahead.
Go ahead, David.
No, it's fine.
No, please go ahead.
I was just going to say that's Kant's distinction between a posteriori and a priori, right? So innateness in Kant's definition is simply that the structure existed before experience, as opposed to emerging out of experience, right? So model free in my mind means that everything is learned from experience, which no algorithm ever written can do because it runs in a model, right? It runs on a computer or some sort of structured algorithm. So you can't escape innateness. It's just where you choose to draw the line. And Kant does, I think, a good job at this by distinguishing between a priori knowledge, which is model stuff that's encoded in the mechanism that's doing the learning, and a posteriori knowledge, which is knowledge that comes after you turn it on.
So that's a little bit different, like from the technical definition of model-based versus model-free reinforcement learning, just so you know. So most people work on model-free, what they call model-free reinforcement. So model-based, it means, let's say you're interacting with the world, but you also have a simulator of the world. So you use the simulator to predict things and experiment things and pick an action. And then you take the step in the real world, and then you learn from it, from the difference between your simulator and the world. So that's what they call model-based. It's like having that sort of simulator of the world in your mind, a model of the world that you try to update as you interact with the real world. But all of them have obviously some kind of function that they use to approximate everything. So that they don't call that the model, they call the simulator the model.
It'd be sort of an RL model inside an RL model.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, RL was made to be it was inspired by animal behavior, right? It was meant to be a real interaction with the world, but if you're in academia, your world is your simulator. So that's why most people just play with the model free, and it's harder that people don't work on model based as much unless you're in like a control theory. So then it makes sense because you have these dynamical system equations, and then you can actually do model based RL.
Rose, you had a comment?
I think it's interesting to compare like different types. You know, we talk a lot about, say, computer vision, and that to me seems quite different than some of the parameter generated models that are out there, where there's some amount of work has already gone in to select what you're using, right? So what are the data elements that are going into it in the first place? And so we can sort of think of, even though it's not completely true, we can think of computer vision as having less innate knowledge, right, than some model that's built on a bunch of data where we've sort of already defined what the objects are.
So that's distinct from Payam's description of model free versus, that's a different construction again, in my opinion. So model free means no simulator. Model based means simulator. And
I mean, keep in mind the simulator, you don't necessarily have to have it working, right? You could start with the empty simulator with some function that you're trying to also learn. So that's what it gets tricky when you're trying to learn a simulator and then like bootstrap your way out of, I guess, ignorance. You try to fit a simulator by your interaction in the real world and then use that to predict, and then you keep going. So that's what makes it harder. So you don't necessarily have to have a simulator. It's just the empty function that you also fit during your training. I mean, it's sort of what humans do. I guess, like, you come up with stories in your head of how things work. You act in the world based on those. And if there is discrepancies, you try to revise your model, hopefully, right? Or double down on your wrong model. I don't know in most cases, but.
So that gets back to the theory of explanation. So you're suggesting that explanations are the simulator rolling forwards in time. Right?
Yeah, I mean,
so,
I guess explanations are us putting words to those models, right? If you want to sort of communicate your model to someone, you probably make up a story using language, right? To sort of help people understand what your model is.
but you're not passing the model,
how do you
you're passing
decide what the
parameters.
objects are?
Yeah, how do you define what the objects are? Yeah.
How do you decide what objects go into your simulation in the first place?
Yeah, there are no objects, I guess.
Imagine?
Yeah, so in RL, most of the things, most researchers like to learn from pixels, so there are no objects. Everything is from pixel. So if there are concept of object, it's going to be implicit. There won't be any objects, but I guess humans just do it naturally. I don't know how we do it. I guess you guys know more than me why humans sort of are so attracted to objects.
Well,
So
I
when
think
you say,
that's the Chomsky argument. That's the Chomsky argument, right? That there's an innate understanding that there are objects, and that we're talking about relationships between objects. And once we start with objects, then we can build more complex objects out of that. But there has to be some mechanism to be able to start with something, right? And those are the things that exist in the real world.
But I guess now we're getting to the philosophical, I guess, we don't necessarily have to take it there, but I want to argue, are there actually objects, or is it just these hypothetical constructs that are useful, so we just imagine them and then we keep building on top of it? There are no objects in real world.
So there are no objects was the name that Ian McGilchrist wanted to call his new book.
Okay, good. I'm glad to be accidentally aligned with somebody much smarter than me.
Sorry, Rose.
So the Chomsky argument is saying that there are objects, right? There's something built into us. I think he is, yeah.
But not that there are objects in the world, but that humans, I guess, have an innate tendency to define these objects in their mind because they're useful.
So I think it's relevant to bring in the distinction between objects and types. I think when you say the word object, you mean type, right? An instance of a type. Right?
I don't know what a type is.
Category theory. So, okay.
Excuse me.
So true and false are objects, or they are objects of the type Boolean, right? So there is a type of thing called a person, right? And and the chair behind me is not a person, but the person sitting in it is a person. And so we draw these distinctions. This gets into the idea of maps and grasping. So I would argue the definition of an object is something that is graspable in our mind. So we can either pick it up and manipulate it physically, or we can pick it up and manipulate it mentally, as it were. So that defines what an object is. And then when we load that object into when we grasp that object, the context in which that grasping takes place is the type. It is saying, okay, so if I'm holding a cup, then I can manipulate it in certain ways, right? So that is the context. So when we grasp the cup, what comes with that is a context of past experience as to how we can manipulate that object. Objects that are graspable can be, are things. And so they have place cells, place and thing cells bound to them. And these place and thing cells can essentially create nodes in the map structure of your brain, the grid cells, right? So I perceive a model that works roughly like this, where you have a grasping mechanism that gives you the idea of objects types as the context of those objects that we can grasp. And if we have a graspable object and we have experience of a graspable object, then that would have a identifier in your mind in the form of a place cell or a thing cell. And then you can use these constructs to create graphs, simple graphs in your grid cell kind of thing. So that's my kind of floppy answer to your very good question of what is an object. So does that make sense?
Yeah,
Some?
makes sense. I mean, I was just thinking like a chair and a shoe and a ball are objects like at that level. But yeah, I mean, that's a much more comprehensive view of object.
Right. So
Yeah, I wasn't thinking about, I guess, abstract objects, but you're right, those could also be objects. And I guess the distinction might be important. I don't know.
So there's two structures in the brain. One is involved in actually grasping physical objects, and then there's a neighboring region, according to McGilchrist anyway, which actually is engaged in the mental idea of grasping, and they share a lot of common machinery. So one, I think, evolved from the other. But when Chomsky is talking about constructing language, to me, that's a layer on top of grasping and context and things like that. And when we draw these graphs of objects, when we say that this is inside that and next to that and on top of this, that's actually happening in the grid cell structure of your brain. So these very, very simplistic models of mind, I find, are quite limiting, and perhaps we need to move to a slightly more sophisticated description of the model, if you will, and perhaps trying to transport that model into a machine learning framework would be an interesting thing to do. So,
Yeah, I mean, it does seem there's kind of a difference between the grasping and the language component. One can imagine, grasping a cup independent of language.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, in that sense, there are a lot of overlaps because there are a lot of similarities in sort of the intelligence process, for lack of a better term. But nonetheless, there are some, I mean, if one can exist independent of the other, then they're clearly spanning somewhat different domains.
So you're suggesting that language and grasping are disconnected in some way?
Well, I mean, I can imagine, I don't know, an individual growing up, without any human interaction, being able to visualize the objects and do stuff with it without having labels for it that describe what he's doing.
That's what monkeys do, right? I mean, monkeys can grab cups and they can't speak and they don't know what the name of it is, right?
Well, I don't know. Do we know they can't speak?
Well, if you believe Planet of the Apes, I guess they can't. But
Well, I mean, can we generify it to communicate? Because if you use the word communicate, then they certainly can communicate.
yeah, fair enough.
So is verbal utterances really a distinction that's worthy of merit? Maybe.
I think Chomsky also talks about unified grammar as being a mechanism to think. He doesn't necessarily, as far as I know, he doesn't necessarily think about it in terms of communication. He thinks of it in terms of this is how we go about thinking.
But that's the simulator that Payam was alluding to then, right? So thinking is the simulator, right? It's the
right, right. And so in order to think, you need to be able to identify objects and think or talk about relationships between objects. And a huge part of this is what are the objects that we are going to think about or talk about or whatever. And that's kind of where the model comes in, I think, is that we need to first of all identify the objects And then we have different layers of abstraction. So even with vision, right, we're starting with pixels and then we're combining things together with some kind of relationship, and we can start to build up levels of abstraction. And so we start to go from tiny pixels to circles to eyes to faces and to relationships between them, right? Is this in a person or is this in an animal or something else? And I think that's what Chomsky is saying. Before we get to uttering anything, we have created these structures inside, some of which are innate. And then we build upon that with our experience to build different layers of abstraction.
Mhm. Oh, that sounds right to me. Where does this get us though? I mean, okay, so what we're saying then is that the GPT-3 has so much data that not only can it intuit the structures of language itself, but it can also intuit the mechanism, the underlying mechanism that we use to comprehend language, right? So it has so much data, it can actually approximate both at the same time, right? So it can not only approximate. Well,
if it doesn't have the idea of innate objects, right? It's just trying to, from experience, it's trying to build things up. Maybe things that are important to us as humans will never be understandable.
Yeah, I think it goes back to the word you just used, like understandable, right? Like, so from what I saw from all the reading the Chomsky stuff, it talks about like the grammar of the language, all the rules, how do you construct things in a proper way, how do you learn to construct proper sentences. But it never, at least as far as I read, didn't get into the meaning of the words, right? Like you can totally construct things that are coherent, make sense, they're probable in some statistical way from the language, and that's how these language models work. But there's nothing behind it, right? If there was no, like, there's, as Rose was saying, there's no understanding of the objects that are in the sentence. It just, GPT-3 just spits out these things that are very probable, the words that go together statistically. And to us, they are meaningful. That's why it fools us, right? Because you read it, it makes sense, but there's nothing behind it on the other side. So I don't know how you distinguish between the meaning in the words and the actual like grammar and the rules behind the sentence.
So this is where we get into the bizarre topic of the gut brain, which Chomsky talks about in the book that you recommended. And so I think Chomsky's argument goes along the lines that how do I put this? So to go back to the soup analogy.
I think I know this section you're talking about, where he's talking about internal and external.
So language to me is kind of like salt and pepper in the soup, right? It is not the soup. So we have an underlying, so we are ancient creatures, and intelligence first emerged in the gut, where we needed to make sure that bad food, good food came in and bad food stayed out, and parasites stayed out, and things like that. So we developed a very sophisticated, we evolved a very sophisticated set of mechanics that allow us to manage our digestive tract with great efficiency and very, very, and this is billions of years old. Language evolved maybe millions of, hundreds of millions of years ago, I don't know. But this ancient brain is the seat of consciousness, if you will, and language, and even the neurological systems that sit on top of language are exactly that. They sit on top of it, and they are injecting chemicals into the soup that's essentially changing the thinking of the digestive, the gut brain, whatever you want to call it. And so language is just an intermediate form between sound and biochemical compounds that are being injected into your bloodstream, or neurological signals that are triggering neurons in your gut brain, whatever you want to call it. These you're kind of looking in the wrong place, is my understanding of the gut-brain argument, which is that all of these neurological structures evolved long after the gut-brain evolved. And essentially all they're doing is they are influencing this very ancient structure. So that's where meaning comes from. Meaning is actually in the gut brain, if you will. And all of this stuff sitting on top of it is very elaborate and very sophisticated. But at the end of the day, all it's doing is manipulating the concentrations of various biochemicals and certain electrical potentials in this ancient brain structure. Maybe. But that's kind of the gut brain argument.
But maybe that's like another, maybe then there is a third one, because I was thinking about meaning in terms of like an information theoretic way, like semantics, right? Like even beyond, like forget about the physiology of how we process meaning. But so if you say there is a blue book, so there is a grammar, there is words, and those words do go together is correct. And you can go, like GPT-3 can continue by stringing other words that go along with that, and that works. But then when we say that, we're actually referring to this hypothetical object, the blue book that's sitting somewhere, presumably, right? So that's what I'm calling the meaning, that just outside of us, you don't need humans for a blue book to exist. Like even humans, all this, well, maybe we do, that's a different story. But
Yes, you have to kind of go back and read the philosophy on that one, yes.
Yeah, but I meant semantics, I guess, by meaning. I don't mean like a deep sort of sense of the word meaning, but just the semantics of what is the purpose of that sentence, not just what it's actually written down. So there's
when you say blue book, you're talking about, to me, two categories: the category of blue things and the category of book-like things, right? And you're saying that this object that I hold exists in both of these categories, right? So this is where category theory is so interesting, because it attempts to resolve that. And I'm not disputing that, right? So this is where we have to get into.
But there is some question as to like, where is the information like located? Like, can you say it's located somewhere? So let's say instead of a blue book, I say there is a book, the color you love. So that some of that information is in your head now, because it's not in the sentence which color you love, right? So, so there is a whole debate about where is the meaning of that sentence located. Is it in both of our brains? Is it somewhere in the universe? It's not in the sentence. So that's the problem, because GPT-3 can only work with what's in the sentence. So it's missing the context and everything else it's sitting in our brains and our a priori knowledge and everything else, right?
Yeah. And when you said blue book, I thought about car prices.
Yeah, there you go. That's another one. Yeah. So I guess the information in your brain is totally different than mine. I meant the literal blue book, but.
No, but now that I said it, right? Because you have the context. You totally understand. Whereas you weren't, that was not your meaning at the point in time, right? And
so
I think
accidentally came up with a great example.
But Gilchrist is talking about the whole time, is that it's relationships between things that's really what's important. It's not the things themselves, and it's not the categories. It's how we relate them to other things. That's really where the meaning is.
Category theory agrees with you, Rose, because category theory's main claim has nothing to do with categories and things and categories. It actually has to do with relationships between things and categories. So I would violently agree with you on that. Yes.
I mean, the other major thing that's really missing, and I'm surprised people don't talk about it more, is like memory, right? Like a lot of the things we're talking about, it requires memory. Like if your memory reset every 5 seconds, then all these things go down the drain. But a neural network doesn't really have memory. It has some maybe billions of input-output things that it can pop out, but there is no memory. Like you can't go and think into its past experience. It can't create new experience. So that's the major thing that's missing. And as far as I know, nobody's working on creating real memory. I think maybe people worked on it back in the 60s and 70s, but I haven't heard of anybody working on it.
But we don't even understand our own memory.
No,
like we think of memory as like the memories are there, but they're not. The memories are constantly being evolved too. And
they're
a lot
constructed.
of the time we're replacing them with, yeah, they're constructed, and like they're very dynamic. Like we reconstruct them on a pretty regular basis.
So is the future actually less known to us than the past?
You don't think that's
I
true?
hope so.
I hope so, otherwise I'm lost.
So what did you have for lunch 3 weeks ago on you know, like you don't know, right? So what you do
Yeah,
is
we
you
kind of
sample a probabilistic likelihood of what you would have probably had for lunch on that day, and you'll call that your memory. And what are you going to have for lunch tomorrow? Well, you would sample the likely lunches that you're likely to have tomorrow, and you would say, probably that one. Is there a difference?
Yeah, one is
Is
you can
that
change,
really
the
what
other
would
one you
happen,
can't.
David?
No,
Is that what you would do though? Because I think when we're talking about human stuff, what we would do is think to myself like, well, was I someplace special, or was there some reason that I should remember Tuesday 3 weeks ago? And if there was some emotional charge to it, I might be, oh, Tuesday 3 weeks ago this happened, and I remember exactly what I ate. Other than that, I might just say, no clue, doesn't matter.
Right. So when it's no clue, doesn't matter, what we do is we replace actual memory with an approximation. So I could say, I probably went to one of these 3 restaurants because I like to go to those restaurants more often than most others, or I probably had lunch at home if that's what I usually do.
I mean, sometimes that's the case, right? I mean, maybe these are for useless memories that we've learned to forget as soon as
Not
possible.
arguing,
But if
yeah.
somebody asks you about your childhood friend, you probably remember. You don't probabilistically come up with a version of some friend you might have had, right?
But if you can't remember, my point being, then you default to a model, right? You default to some predictive
Do
model.
you? Or do you just say you don't know? Like, do you make stuff up? I don't think we do. I
But
don't think we
witnesses
say,
do,
oh,
right?
well,
Like witnesses to crimes apparently do, right? There have been studies.
There's
like,
embarrassing amounts of
yeah, but there's emotional charge there, right?
Sure.
That's different. That's reconstructing a memory because of emotional charge, as opposed to just like not important, no clue.
Mhm.
I guess what I'm
I
trying to
think
get
this
at
comes
is
back
that
to the uncertainty.
Go ahead, Rose. Sorry.
Well, I guess I think as humans, we can handle uncertainty, and we'll just sort of say, I don't know. Whereas with models, we almost force an answer, right? Even if the probability is very low, we give an answer because we have to.
Right.
As opposed to, there's the difference between I know and I don't know, as opposed to I've probabilistically generated something.
Well, or in a Bayesian framework, I mean, I don't know is equivalent to having a diffuse posterior.
Right.
But in fact, we do know some things, and our posterior can incorporate our priors, which in some sense are our memories.
So the problem with the Bayesian perspective is that you can never normalize it, right? Like you don't know all the possibilities, so you can never normalize the denominator in the base. You don't know all the possibilities. You can't put numbers on it because you don't know everything. You know likelihood ratios maybe, so you know what's more likely than something else, but I don't think you can put a number to anything because
I mean, I guess that's not a real constraint, because even if you don't know the shape of that denominator, you can form the ratio of 2 outcomes and give it a likelihood.
Yeah. So I think that's the best you can do. But I mean, going back to what Rose was saying, like, so a neural network, if you have let's say a 10 class model that classifies things into 10 classes, there's no option to say it's none of these 10. It has to pick one. So then it's going to be wrong if you give it something that's not in that 10 class.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think memory is fascinating. I think about memory all the time because it's actually really, really, really interesting. So,
so is language. As I was reading the piece, I hadn't really thought about some of this stuff before. So just, yeah, it's interesting, and it cuts across so much of, what we do and what we're trying to think about.
Mhm.
And memory is another component of that too.
I think the problem with language is that it's coming in too late. Like, we've already formed the structures by the time we come to expressing them. And we almost want to go back a step before that to try and understand, like, how do we form those structures? Like, what is innate, and then what do we do after that?
So that's one of the
to again select the objects.
So that's one of the things. So I listened to, you guys know Sam Harris probably. He has this meditation app that I joined in when it was free, and then he promised that it will be free forever. Now it's quite expensive, but now I got access for free. But anyways, he has these mindfulness meditation things. So that's, as far as I can tell, that's one of the purposes of it. Like some of the guided things is like you look at an object and you try to remove everything you think about it, like so you just look at it as a bunch of pixels without try not to understand things. Like that seems to be a good chunk of what these meditative practices are about, to try to look at things without any interpretation, which is really hard.
Yeah.
But apparently if you stare at even a cup for long enough, eventually you'll see it as a bunch of pixels without any context. I can't say that I have experienced it, but I guess other people have.
I think this is where the McGilchrist stuff gets really interesting too, because he's sort of talking about the idea of identifying living things, and that it's a different, it's the left brain that identifies inanimate objects, and we sort of are plucking them out of a flow. We're taking away the dynamism from them. I still think the way he thinks about it is the most interesting that I've read.
And so once again, I would go back. I really like McGilchrist, by the way. I'm very much a fan of his work, but I think that part of the living thing aspect is mirror neurons. Once again, we need to kind of move on from these very naive black box models and kind of need to peer under the hood and start constructing mental models of human-like agents, which is what I'm trying to do. But so the distinction to me between other living things and inanimate objects is the triggering of the mirror neurons, right? So if I can look at an animatronic robot that's doing something, right, and it's triggering my mirror neurons, I imbue that object with life, right? I essentially suspend my disbelief and presume that this animatronic robot is actually alive, right? And when you see the Boston Dynamic robots dancing or whatever, we do that, right? Because they're moving in very realistic ways. That's getting into another one of these kind of substructures of our intelligence. So the left brain, right brain distinction, I think, about inanimate versus non-inanimate is not that great, but the idea is very good. It's just the locating of the kind of the underlying mental structure, I think, is a little bit different than my understanding. So, which kind of leads me to the question of where do we go from here? Like, do we want to try and construct? Do we want to look at memory? Do we want to go deeper into language? Do we want to transition to someone like McGilchrist, which is very daunting because his books are very fat and very dense?
Yeah, I've tried reading him. I don't understand him. Like, I keep reading and I just don't get it.
Right. Chapter 2 is a bitch.
Really?
Yeah.
Everything he says goes against my intuition. Maybe that's part of the problem.
Okay, maybe that's why it's easier for me. Everything he says, I'm like, yeah, I totally get that.
I mean, which is fine.
I've read
I
the
don't
first part of his new book. Have
What
you
is his
started
new
the new
book?
book, David?
It hasn't come out as an audio book yet.
Matter-
So I can't read huge bodies of text. My eyes are crap, so I can't read
I've
books.
just finished part 1.
Okay, how is it?
It's a lot of the same ideas. I mean, I like it. I don't know that it's worth the commitment. Certainly part 1 isn't. I mean, he's again talking, I mean, he's making a very specific argument, right? That we have the reductionist view of the world it's dangerous. And it causes us to behave in a way that is not really how we're supposed to behave as human beings. That it leads us to a way of thinking that decontextualizes, and we sort of jump to conclusions about things that we shouldn't be jumping to conclusions about. And in the long run, it's bad for us because it squeezes everything that's good for us out of our lives. So he talks a lot of, case studies on schizophrenics, case studies on people who've had either left brain or right brain damage. I don't know that it would be of interest to everyone. I think
Right.
part 2, he's trying to bring together the ideas more, but if you don't have the basis from part 1, certainly if you didn't like, and I had a hard time reading The Master and His Emissary, I don't think it's worth investing in the time needed to read this section.
Yeah, maybe the problem is, I guess I don't have the time or interest to go dig into the literature he bases these things on. He just says things and then you either believe him or you don't. And I have no reason to go one way or the other. And I'm just doubtful. So I don't know, is he a controversial character in neuroscience, or do people like generally agree with his theories?
He makes the what do they call it? The pie eating contest argument, where he opens the book saying, well, I've read 24,000 papers, right? And so that should shut up my critics. It's very hard to argue with people in that stance. And I get the sense that that's where Chomsky is coming from too, is that he made some very good and very, very profound discoveries early in his career and then spent the rest of his career fighting off everyone else to preserve his ideas, which I don't know if that's very useful, but
More than one might think.
I think the other issue is that we have a tendency to believe what we believe. And like when I'm reading McGilchrist, I look at I have gone and looked up some of the studies and stuff, and it's like, again, he's looking at the data to try and support the idea that he already has. I happen to agree with him, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the only way to look at it.
I mean, that's one of the things I learned from COVID. If there's one good thing that came out of it, like people can read the exact same like paragraph and come up with the exact opposite kind of conclusions and be 100% confident of their conclusions, right? And you don't know which one you are. Are you the one who is right or wrong? But apparently, if other people can do that, anybody is susceptible, right? So I've just started doubting everything that I think. So yeah, I don't accept anything I read in the book unless there is like backed up with some incontrovertible truth that I think it's impossible. So I just don't believe anything, which is, I don't know, this is probably not a good recipe for a happy life, but
It's probably better than the alternatives.
When I did oral tradition Chinese medicine, the teacher I followed would never teach anything without first describing the context of like who was saying it and why they were saying it. And it's like, okay, this is coming from people and this is how they thought about the issue. And it's not that there's a right or wrong, it's just like, here is a mental model. And if you're going to use this mental model, here's how you're going to use it, right? And I think the reality is that we have to be able to hold sometimes completely competing views and not have a clear answer on which is correct. Like we are bounded by our own intellectual ability to understand things that maybe we just don't have the capacity to understand.
Yeah, but don't you agree? Like ultimately, there must be some experiment that is the judge. If you can't even think about even fundamentally about some experiment that verifies whether what, let's say, McGilchrist says about a particular topic is correct or wrong, then I think his word is as good as mine. Like I don't know, it's all noise. It's all bunch of like maybe he has better intuitions, maybe not. I mean, who knows? So I would just ignore anything that can't be experimentally verified. I guess it's impossible. You have to assume things to go through life, but I trust my own intuition more than somebody else's if there is no experimental evidence for it, right?
You see, I think some of it comes down to utility, and it sounds weird to hear me say that, but at the end of the day, it's like, what is good for us, regardless of whether it's right or wrong, or you can prove it or not prove it, right? If we try and reduce everything and take the meaning out of everything, we're left with a bunch of maybe facts, but it doesn't. That's not what leads to a fulfilling life. And so then you,
Well, I don't know. I guess
at the higher levels.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was
No,
just
please go
gonna
ahead.
say that's one of those statements. Again, I don't know. Do you say it doesn't lead to a fulfilling life? I would say, what is your evidence? Like I would say, a fact-based life is a fulfilling life. I don't need to imagine things and create meaning out of nowhere that's not grounded on facts. Is there any evidence of that not being fulfilling?
You see, he takes it to the extreme of people who do that, which is why he talks so much about schizophrenics, who have a very fact-based view of the world. He talks a lot about both schizophrenics and autistic spectrum, like on the far end of the spectrum. And really what goes along with that is an inability to function in our society, and I would say a lot of like unhappiness.
I mean, so
whereas
that's
on the other end of the spectrum,
yeah. So
you
that's
might have people who have like.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
Go ahead,
the other
sorry.
end, like let's say you have, I mean, you can be religious and be extremely happy and have a fulfilling life. So if we put the bar on like what is fulfilling, if that's what you want to maximize, it might be very different than what is truthful, right? I know many religious people that are very, very happy, content. They got everything figured out. Everything fits nicely into a model. They ignore everything else that doesn't, and they're very happy. They live happy lives. They have happy families, and that's it. I mean, if that's what you want to maximize, I mean, I'm just questioning that the fulfilling and happiness is not necessarily the only way to live your life. I guess you could be miserable and unhappy, but care more about the truth. And I mean, they're all extremes, right? You probably don't want to go in either of the extreme. I'm just saying these things are not super clear. Like I distrust anybody who says this is the way to a fulfilling life, because that's how all religions started, right?
Okay, but by the same token, anybody who says this is how to live a truthful life, and this is how to optimize your life based on facts, that's also a difficult proposition, right?
Yeah, fully agree. Like I'm not saying this is the way. I'm just saying this is a way, and it's not necessarily worse than the other ways. It's just different people's opinions, and I don't think you can decide which is better or worse.
No, I totally agree with you, which is why it comes down to like individuals making decisions based upon their values, their particular context. Whereas I think we often try and attribute truth and goodness as going hand in hand, and maybe they don't.
Well, I got a question for both you guys. Suppose you could design a multi-agent RL framework. Could you answer those types of questions you just posed? I mean, at some level, it presupposes sort of all the memory and language that we've talked about.
Yeah, I don't even know how to start answering these questions with a RL framework. There's so many different things you have to, I guess, think about. I mean, first of all, what is, like, there are no emotions, right? Like a lot of these things that we're talking about is because we're emotional beings, right? We care about well-being. I mean, yeah, so it's kind of hard to know how well you're doing if you don't feel it.
Okay, but you could think about parameterizing that to some degree.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, you know, it kind of seems like an off the wall question, but I think in a couple of years, people are going to be trying to solve some of these problems computationally.
But that goes back to the whole Hume that we read, right? That can you get ought from is, right? I think that's what might be the point of the contention, because let's say you have all the facts and truth. I guess if you believe Hume, which I tend to, you can't come up with an objective way of what you should be doing or what everybody should be doing. I mean, you can probably come up with ways you shouldn't be doing, right? You can come up with ways that everybody will be miserable or most people will be miserable and rule those out. But if you want to come up with the best way to be as a society or as a human being, there's probably infinite number of answers and there's no objectively correct one.
Yeah.
Perhaps, and perhaps you can come up with some useful categories about bad, better.
Yeah, that's what Sam Harris argues, right? Like he says, like he has a book on this and he actually argues completely against Hume. And he says, absolutely, you can deduce ought from is. And it's just, he actually quotes Wittgenstein as saying, this is one of those misfiring of language that we think we can't. He goes, like his argument is something like, imagine the worst possible world where everybody is maximally miserable. And then you start from there and then you try to use the facts that make people miserable and go in the direction of making people better. And then he says, sure, he calls it the moral landscape, where there's a bunch of ups and downs, and there are some places that are generally worse, or some places that are generally better. And he argues that, yeah, using what we know about human psychology, science, all of this, we can definitely point to what should be done and what shouldn't be done. Like oppressing people is bad because there's lots of reasons. And so he argues that as long as we agree that, I guess, well-being is a good measure that we want to improve, there are scientific ways of going. I'm not sure I agree with it, but he wrote a whole book on it.
I guess my feeling is that as soon as we put this in a formal computational model of any kind, it will be exploited and the system will be gamed. I think it's what we've seen in every other place where we've formalized anything. I think it happens in the legal system. We're seeing it more and more happening in just using AI. And I think there are people out there who have a different utility function than what's good for people in general. And when you give them the playbook, and especially when you give them the playbook in computational form, it's a dangerous situation.
Sorry, guys, I have to jump off. I have another call.
Okay. Well,
Thanks, this was very interesting. Just let me know what you decide to talk about.
okay, sure.
All right,
All right, take care. Yeah, so
I'm going to need to go too. Do you have a memory reference that we could look at maybe?
I don't, but perhaps I might actually do something really weird and present my understanding as a discussion point next time. So I might actually kind of try and put some of my ideas into a form that we could discuss at least. That might be useful because we're getting to the very edge of a traverse through the literature. Like we're pretty much up to current thinking, I think. So perhaps it might be useful for us to, each of us, present our own understanding to each other and critique it, and perhaps that might be a useful next step. What do you think? Worthy of an attempt?
if you're willing to do that next week, I'd love to hear that.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, I always like hearing your
Sounds great.
thoughts and observations.
Okay, sure. So I'll put something together and I'll post a link and we can go from there. Very interesting discussion. I would suggest reading on in the article. The remainder of the article is actually pretty interesting. And we can also discuss that a little bit as well.
Good.
Great.
Sounds good. Have a
All
great
right,
weekend,
everyone.
everyone. Bye.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye.